Welcome everybody. This is the speaker series for the Energy Systems Management Program at the University of San Francisco. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar, Building Decarbonization, Accelerating the Energy Transition in California. My name is Mary Biswal and I will be your host and moderator for today. Before we get started, a couple of things to note. We will be going through the panel discussion today for about an hour and we will end at 2 p.m. In case you have any technical difficulties joining into the webinar, please contact our program assistant, Clark, on the email provided in the chat box. All participants except the panelists have been muted at this time to ensure better flow of the session. But we certainly want to hear from you. So in case you have any comments or questions, please feel free to drop in your questions and leave them in the Q&A box below. Please be sure to use the Q&A box and not the chat box. We will be taking questions from the Q&A box at the end of the panel discussion. So with that, let's get started and welcome our speakers for today. First, we have Brady Seals from Rocky Mountain Institute. Brady is a senior associate with Building Electrification Program at Rocky Mountain Institute. She works at the junction of air quality, buildings, and human health. Recently, she published a report on health effects of gas stoves in residential buildings. Before she started working with Rocky Mountain, she spent about 11 years across 16 countries working on acceleration of transition of cooking from solid fuels to clean cookstoves. Next, we have Ben Clarin. Ben is from Electric Power Research Institute. He's a senior project manager in the Advanced Buildings and Smart Communities program, and he manages projects that demonstrate and deploy an integrated set of customer resources, such as smart thermostats and network-enabled technologies. And the projects actually help in meeting customer and utility goals and inform policy discussions. His previous experience includes working on energy efficient technology, road mapping, understanding smart devices in homes, and strategies to deploy emerging technologies into utility energy efficiency programs. And finally, we have Brian Barnacle from Building Decarbonization Coalition. Brian is the Director of Market Development, and he works closely with a lot of subject matter experts to develop strategy, design campaigns, and fundraising. And before he was working with the Building Decarbonization Coalition, Brian worked extensively on clean energy policy, market transformation with consulting companies, where he directed new product development and national expansion initiatives. So I'll start this session by talking a little bit about the topic we are addressing today, building decarbonization sector. California is one of the world leaders in clean energy policies, and the state has an aggressive, comprehensive clean energy plan that aims at achieving 100% carbon-free electricity by the end of 2045. Now, although the main sources of emissions are power sector and the transportation sector, the California Air Resources Board reports that 25% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the state actually come from the building sector. This includes both commercial sector and the residential sector. About 2/3 of the emissions in the buildings actually come from natural gas, propane for space and water heating and cooking, and the remaining 1/3 comes from electricity usage in buildings. We will be hearing a lot more about this in detail from our speakers today. And in our session, the overall agenda for today, we will focus on 3 main topics. We'll try to understand California's current suite of policy, regulations, and programs that are in place to address building decarbonization, and the local and regional action that is happening in the state. Second, we will talk about the market of building electrifications and trying to understand the practical aspects of implementing building electrification projects, particularly from an economical standpoint, and what are the technologies that are in the market now. And finally, we'll also look at the impacts of building emissions from an air quality, health, and equity standpoint, and how crucial it is to reduce emissions, not just to achieve climate goals, but also from a health and air quality perspective. So with that, I want to go ahead and start a discussion with the first question to the panel. And I'd like to start by asking each of our speakers here today about your story and your inspiration to work in this field. So I think our viewers today, a lot of whom are students and young professionals, would be interested to hear this. And so if you could share a little bit about how you started in the building sector and what's your inspiration. And following that, if you could also talk about your current work and how your work and the overall work of your organization helps in the efforts towards building emission reduction. I'll start with you, Brian.
Great, thank you, Mary, and thanks everybody for tuning in today. So the Building Decarbonization Coalition is a group that tries to organize diverse stakeholders towards a common outcomes. So we work with manufacturers and utility companies, equity groups, environmental justice, increasingly with the health advocacy groups, and of course, the advocates that are on the ground, and really try and find common ground and push for complete decarbonization of buildings. So some of our early successes have been working with the local governments and getting so many local governments to adopt all electric reach codes and natural gas bans. And what we're seeing is that by having the local governments adopt those, we're capturing the attention of manufacturers who are concerned about fracturing their markets and the regulations that govern, what their market looks like, and turn it into, and actually see where the writing's on the wall and start to come around and push for, building electrification and building decarbonization. In terms of my personal journey of what got me here, I did a lot of business development and partnerships and sales and things like that in the energy efficiency space. And after just seeing the climate models and continuing to see, ice sheets breaking off and wildfires, poisoning the indoor air quality of my loved ones, and just recognizing that, if we're going to take climate seriously, natural gas doesn't have a future in it. That got me to where I just said, I'm not going to work on natural gas efficiency anymore. I need to be working on unwinding our dependence on fossil fuels. And so that's really what's brought me here and what drives me and gets me up every day.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ryan. Ben?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ben Clarin. As Mary mentioned, I work at the Electric Power Research Institute. So for those of you who don't know what EPRI is, it's a not-for-profit organization kind of with a goal of doing applied research, development, and deployment projects all across the energy sector, from everything from centralized generation plants to transmission wires to distribution assets. And where I work, which I think is the most interesting and dynamic part of the industry, is in the end use side, with a particular focus on buildings and the advancements in building technologies, as well as the built environment that they create. So looking at it from a very kind of technology, but also customer focus, and understand that if we have these large goals as far as both at the municipal, the state, sometimes the national, and even the global as far as decarbonization, that's going to have several step changes as far as how an energy system needs to be planned, operated, and managed. Before I was at EPRI, I had worked in the renewable energy industry, but also kind of at the capital programs and construction. I actually worked for SF Muni for a little bit, and understood, really got an understanding some of the challenges it would take to implement some of these somewhat obvious technologies that make sense, but know that there are opportunities and actionable approaches that you have to create business cases for various different stakeholders to make it happen. And that's really what I do now at EPRI. Is I manage projects with a diverse group of stakeholders looking at here is our targets when it comes to low carbon and zero carbon building design. Let's get together, let's figure out how to make this done cost effectively. Let's understand when people come in them, what the impacts are, and then feed that to our members, which are the electric utilities across the globe, and figure out, okay, how do we design an energy system knowing that we need to meet some of these decarbonization targets.
Thank you, Ben. Brady?
Hi, everyone. So nice to be here, and thanks for spending a part of your afternoon with us. My name is Brady Seals. I'm at the Rocky Mountain Institute on the building electrification team. For those of you that don't know, Rocky Mountain Institute is also a nonprofit organization that's been around for nearly 40 years with the sole focus on the energy transition in the US, but also globally. So there's a number of different programs attacking this from all angles. And so I sit on the building electrification team. And the way that I got here was really quite accidentally. In fact, I did not know anything really about buildings or anything about US policy. I spent my whole career, 11 or 12 years at this point, working internationally on clean cook stoves and around the world where people are still cooking with wood and charcoal, trying to help get to cleaner alternatives. So when I interviewed for RMI, it was not for buildings. And so I was surprised when they asked if I would come to this side because I didn't see the overlap immediately. But what I found is actually building electrification has so many health and air quality co-benefits. And so that's what I do on the team. I try to weave in the indoor and outdoor air quality piece along with all of the great human health co-benefits that we get when we electrify buildings. And so I'm really happy that it's actually has so much overlap from my past work and many of the same scientists, researchers, health professionals working on these issues. And we still have a long way to go, I think, in this country, but weaving in these extra pieces and benefits, I think we've seen to be really useful, and we're just getting started, in my opinion. My inspiration for this, and I'll say working on air quality generally, is the fact that it is solvable. Like, we create a lot of the air pollution. It's the #1 environmental health risk for early death in the country. And half of that is from the burning of fossil fuels. So my inspiration is, I know that this is solvable and this is doable, and the more people and policymakers and advocates we can engage, I think the sooner we'll start to see these really dramatic reductions in pollution that we know will improve health.
Thank you, Brady. That's great. I think we are all realizing the importance of air quality more so recently with the bad air AQ index, with the wildfire and everything going around. But thank you so much. It's great to hear about your personal journey and what your organization and your work does at this time. And so I will start with my first topic today, and which is understanding California's current policy and programs, and what are the current actions at local level and regional level in terms of policy, programs, and regulations. And I want to bring you in, Brian, on this. And if you could tell us a little bit about how you view the current state of building decarbonization efforts at local and regional state levels in the US, particularly in California. And according to you, what would be a good policy and strategy roadmap to accelerate the building decarbonization?
Yeah, thank you. Really great question. And we're starting to see movement, and it's an exciting time because 2 years ago it really wasn't a policy topic. It really wasn't on a lot of people's radar, and so in a matter of 2 years, it's gone from being a niche thing with a small group of people working on it to now there's several organizations like Rocky Mountain Institute and others. EPRI's been on this for a long time, of course, but you know, that have dedicated teams that are working just on building decarbonization and building electrification. So, you know, at the local level, I think we're seeing that really it's split between a lot of local governments who are ready to take, you know, bold actions. They've either adopted REACH codes, and now they're looking at the next thing that they can do to look at existing buildings. And then you have other local governments who are digging in their heels and siding with the fossil fuel industry. And it's unfortunate. And you know, the research that Rocky Mountain Institute's doing and that Brady's doing around indoor air quality is really going to be important to bringing some of those people along and showing just how damaging natural gas is when it's in your home. You know, I'm a renter right now, and the last 4 places I've lived in have had gas stoves and don't have properly functioning fan hoods. And that's, you know, it borders on criminal, because every time that I cook dinner, I'm putting toxic levels of emissions into my home. And so at the local level, it's really split, but it's awesome to see a growing movement at the local level and not a receding movement. At the state level, there's a lot of people that are seeing the writing on the wall. The Air Resources Board just put out a study that basically said we have to get to 100% electric buildings. You know, that's great precedent, not just in California, but in states like Massachusetts and New York and Colorado, where they've adopted bold climate goals. They're starting to realize that they're not going to achieve those goals if they don't do something about burning natural gas in buildings. You know, there's still a lot of hesitance with things like the public safety power shutoffs and people's affection for their gas stoves and things. The state regulators and the governor's office and things like that are concerned about political blowback. They're concerned about reliability and things like that. So there's still a lot of work to be done to build the political will. But in general, I think that we're seeing a lot of momentum on this. You know, 5 months ago, I think everybody thought that it would be impossible for us to have an all-electric building code in California in 2022. And over the last few months, we've organized more than 100 different organizations to sign on and promote this. We're working with different industry stakeholders to find negotiated positions so that they're not opposing it. And there's a chance that we could actually, the California Energy Commission could adopt an all-electric building code for 2022. And it's everybody that's working together and pushing for common outcomes, and that's making all this progress happen. It really is. It's everybody who's doing it. In terms of the policy roadmap and the strategy roadmap, we're seeing that the economics are there in a lot of different areas. In some cases, there's still work to be done, and we can attack that from a couple of different angles. We can, you know, we can try and bring down the cost of the technology. We can also try and regulate gas, right? And so indoor air regs and things like that, those are policy levers that we have that we can use to make gas more expensive. And things like an all-electric code for 2022 would immediately impact about 10% of the sales in the state. So right now, for gas water heaters, they're about 90% market share or more. And they're, you know, what that looks like on a sales basis is that manufacturers don't even ship things into the California market. And so if they actually pass an all-electric code for 2022, we're going to send a clear market signal that at least 10% of your sales are going to be all-electric on an annual basis, roughly. And that's huge. So I think each state agency has a role to play, right down to the Department of General Services and divesting, you know, and adopting fossil fuel purchasing moratoriums. But the Air Resources Board really needs to start looking at appliance regulations, because the Energy Commission can't regulate them on energy. The California Public Utilities Commission needs to look at subsidies. The rates right now, the ratepayers are subsidizing the expansion of the fossil fuel industry. So when a new development goes in, 50% of the cost of expanding the gas infrastructure is paid for by existing ratepayers. So we're basically socializing the cost of the natural gas industry's expansion right now in California, despite that there's no way we can achieve our climate goals if they're doing that. So we need to put pressure on them. We need to continue to advocate that, you know, it's sort of a death by 1,000 cuts angle here. And it's going to take everybody working together on several different angles to keep the pressure on. And then I think the thing that I would be remiss by leaving out is that we have to put our frontline communities at the front of the line on this. A lot of the pressure and resistance in the clean energy industry has been that it's only for the wealthy and things like that. And we need to adopt policies and things like that, and programs that are targeted towards our low-income populations, our minority populations, areas where air quality is poor already, and make sure that they're at the front of this movement, and that we're doing this right, because we don't want to be, reducing natural gas down to nothing and seeing prices spike because we've got way less product flowing through the same fixed infrastructure cost, and it's hitting the people who who need help the most, the hardest. So for us, those are our priorities. We look at it as stop expanding it through the building code and through rates and other sorts of incentives and subsidies, and then eventually we just need to adopt a date certain phase out, ideally 2030 or before, so that by 2045 there's no more gas appliances in buildings. I guess just one little plug: the Strategic Growth Council, right, who uses the cap and trade funds, actually allows gas to be hooked up in the buildings that they spend money on. So they fund, transit-oriented development projects and affordable housing projects. And we're actually using greenhouse gas mitigation funds to subsidize the expansion of the fossil fuel industry. So there's a lot of, that's what I mean when we're wound up around natural gas. We just need to find all of these different angles and just start, severing our subsidies, and then eventually, pulling the plug all together and sending the signal that we need to wind it down.
Yeah, that's very insightful. And what caught my attention was that you mentioned about the all-electric 2022 plan that the state has. So how do you see the pushback on this? Where do the utilities stand on this? Because in terms of gas infrastructure and the pipelines that they already have in place, a lot of the assets could go stranded. And so do they see this recovering the fixed cost from the ratepayers, and how does it impact that?
Yeah, well, the actual wind down is something that needs to be thought through in much greater detail. We know that in order to achieve our climate goals, we have to decarbonize buildings. But there's a proceeding on the future of gas, and we need to make sure that that all of this is thought through. How do we retire the natural gas system? And that's not something that that should be taken lightly. That's a long regulatory proceeding. How do you, how are you resolving any stranded assets? Personally, I feel like, when you make an investment, you take a risk. And if your risk is not a good risk, you shouldn't necessarily be asking for bailouts from it, but that's not necessarily how the courts should see it. So there's a lot of things to be worked out when it comes to the future of gas and how we actually wean ourselves off of this. The important thing is that all of the different lanes and the different regulatory proceedings that need to be underway need to get underway right now, because we're looking at 3 to 5 years before anything ever comes out of the regulation. We had SB 1477 that talked about building decarbonization. It took from the time the legislation was passed to the time the money is going to hit the street, it's going to be almost 4 years. Now, if it takes 4 years to go from passing some legislation to actually seeing it impact the market, we're never going to achieve our climate goals. So we need to get started on all these really important proceedings right now, and having really tough conversations, and including the governor. He's got to take leadership on this and really send a message, and we're encouraging him to. So, yeah. And we'll support him when he does.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's an interesting thing you also mentioned about SB 1477. It takes about 4 years to get the money from passing the legislation to actually getting them on projects. So with that, I want to move on to the next topic, which is actually about starting these projects with the money that we get from the state. So implementation of these building decarbonization or building electrification projects. And I want to bring you in, Ben, here. You have a big breadth of experience working with building electrification projects. And so how would you put it in terms of how difficult or easy it is to implement zero energy homes or building electrification projects? And in your view, what are the main challenges and barriers from an economical standpoint and a technological standpoint?
To answer the question on how difficult or easy it is, the answer is yes. It is both difficult and easy, just to be sarcastic a little bit. But however, I think one point that Brian made that's important to understand is the topic of building electrification, especially in the state of California, is something that is relatively new. When you're talking about 2016 building code, I have a project that's about 5 years old. And one of the things us at EPRI tried to propose in that project is when we talk about the conversation of zero net energy, we need to understand kind of the end goal, which is overall kind of climate decarbonization. And so we really need to have a discussion about how to build these buildings with various different fuel mixes. And that was at 2015. And the conversation with the various stakeholders that were giving us that government grant were saying, yeah, that's probably something you don't want to talk about right now. Now, if I were to have that same conversation with that specific organization, and I were to show them that same statement of work, they would say, why didn't you do that? That's the exact type of work that we really need right now. And so it's important to understand how new the topic of building electrification here is, especially in the state of California. And with that being said, how much infrastructure, both from a policy side, but also from a programmatic side, but also from a utility side, is set up for mixed fuel homes, communities, all of that. And so to understand that if you're looking at it from a program standpoint, if I'm looking at it from a developer standpoint, the incentives, the availability of information is something that they're not necessarily accustomed to in a manner that will make sense for them. By that meaning electrification of buildings, and I'll give you my own personal example. This house that I'm living in right now, I've tried to electrify as much as possible. One thing that, and most of those technologies, you asked the question, is it economically viable to electrify? The answer is yes, sometimes. And my own personal example is everything except the water heater is economically viable. And the reason being is that I'm not going to share with you what my house looks like right now because it's my 3-year-old's running around making it a mess. But if you go upstairs and you go to the water heater closet, it does not fit a heat pump water heater, which is the efficient electric alternative to tankless gas. If you look at my service panel, it does not have the electric capacity to provide electricity to a heat pump water heater. So all of those step changes it kind of are things that delay decisions, and sometimes delay decisions in something that has such kind of historic infrastructure about things like gas cooktops and water heating and space heating. That's something that's going to slow it down. One thing I'd also want to, a good point that Brian made was, how do we do this how do we affordably sequence building electrification in a manner that doesn't do it in a way that compromises the societally disadvantaged? And by that meaning is the perception or developing programs and strategies that will be adopted by those who theoretically do have the means to do it, and then putting the cost of servicing and providing reliability from a utility perspective to those who don't. So one thing that we do is work on projects with disadvantaged communities, looking at figuring out the different challenges that these particular communities have, whether it's the differences as far as access to things like Wi-Fi and addressing a digital divide, or even, but what you start seeing is that from a technical standpoint, there are solutions out there, but from a non-energy benefit standpoint, as far as improvements in air quality, things like that, when you do start electrifying, you also see that as well. And kind of my third point to that is one of the things that from a technical, an economical, and a utility standpoint to try to figure out how to make this happen or make this actionable, not only from a single demonstration project, but also scaling, is starting to collect operational data from the first demonstrations that are out there. There is a little bit of risk involved with the first demonstrations when it comes to all electric buildings and communities. But it's important to collect the information to feed it to the policymakers, but also the utilities to say, hey, this is how it's possible. These are the impacts. These are the benefits to the customer and your ratepayer. Now with that, how do we as a group or an organization or as a society design an energy system around that with those goals?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely, that makes sense. And like you mentioned, building electrification also involves a lot of network enabled devices and having that connectivity to the grid. So if you could talk a little bit also about how this rise in electrification would impact the grid side of things, the grid planning, and how does this demand side planning or management, or having a lot of technological infrastructure now with all electric buildings, how does it impact the utilities grid side?
It's an interesting question because it depends on what kind of office in an energy company you sit at. But what I'll say is that there's an opportunity that now that you have an infrastructure of smart technologies that happen within a building and a community, and part of it, we're talking about the electrification of buildings, but from a societal decarbonization from the state, there's also the electrification or the decentralization of energy supply. So moving away from centralized plants to more distributed solar, storage, renewable energy sources. Now, with that step change also comes a need for more of a flexible energy system. Yeah. And as you start developing an infrastructure of electric communities, there's also an opportunity to leverage that infrastructure to provide certain flexibility that an energy system, that a decarbonized energy system would need to entail. So there's that opportunity. However, we're at a point where we're still trying to, is we've just started here, and I think one of the things is how do we continue to focus in on the adoption of electric technologies while we start evaluating the opportunity for making these all electric technologies flexible, so that kind of as we move forward, as the grid becomes cleaner, that infrastructure of flexible energy systems is there.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think, yeah, that's very helpful to know and understand that there is a lot of value for this flexible technology in which both the customer and as well as the utility side, the grid infrastructure also needs to be in sync with each other. But we need to first start with the adoption, and then along the way, make changes as we need it. So with that, I want to move on to my next topic, which is on equity and health impacts of building emissions. And Brady has done a large amount of work on this, and a lot of your work has focused on how important air quality and health and equity is around building emissions, and how crucial health impact of gas infrastructure can be, especially in indoor environments. And so not just from a achieving climate goal standpoint, but also it is just important from a health standpoint. So if you could talk a little bit about what insights you have gained all through your experience, and also how do you think this can be incorporated into shaping policy and making policy changes?
Thanks, Mary. Okay, so I'm going to ask you guys to all do me a quick favor and just indulge me in this. So I just want you to close your eyes, and I want you to think about what you see when I say this word, buildings. What is the vision in your mind? And you can open your eyes now. So when I did this exercise, I thought of the New York City skyline. I'm from New York. I thought of the skyline of buildings. But what we really need to do is put ourselves in those buildings, because we spend 90% of our time in buildings, even before the stay-at-home orders, even before COVID. And buildings are so human-centric, right? They're all about us. What do you see when I say home or work or school? And I think this is part of the issue. Buildings can be so abstract. We can get very deep into thinking about energy efficiency and just narrowing down, whereas focusing out and zooming out and putting ourselves in the buildings and thinking about how buildings impact us and how we impact them, I think is a really critical step. And when we do that, I think it can be very powerful. So 90% of our time in buildings. So the 20,000 breaths we take every day, most of them are in buildings. And I share this fact every time I talk because it just blew my mind when I learned about it. But we spend, as humans, more time in buildings than some whales spend underwater. So the whales are coming up for air more often than we leave our buildings. So this is really critical. And we're not talking enough about what our air quality is. And a major issue is burning combustion devices. You know, when you step back and think, oh my goodness, my gas stove gives off a lot of the same pollutants than my car exhaust, it starts to change the way we frame the discussion. So I think for one, there's just a weaving in on the narrative that can be really powerful. Once we start weaving in the narrative, then we can start weaving in the policies, and then we can start really, I think, unlocking some funds, which is what everyone needs to electrify existing buildings in some senses. So we know that we're making our buildings tighter to be more energy efficient, which is wonderful. But if we don't account for human health, the actual health impacts from trapping pollutants indoors, those health costs may outweigh the energy savings. So I think there is power to be talking about the human element, the health and the equity pieces when we're talking about buildings. ACEEE just released a report maybe last month where they showed if we start weaving in public funding for health and buildings, we can unlock another $2 billion from federal funds every year to upgrade and update our buildings, and electrification is a key piece of that. So when I'm thinking about this, there's a lot of elements in our homes and in our schools and in our buildings that make them healthy or not. But a key one is air, because it's just essential and we can't take it for granted anymore, as all of you in California know. And so I think the interesting thing about electrifying buildings is that you are not only cleaning the air indoors, but you're also cleaning the air outdoors. So indoors, we know that gas stoves have 50 to 400 times higher concentrations of nitrogen dioxide than gas stoves, which is a big number, and that's from the EPA's own documentation. And we know that there are certain populations that are more sensitive to these pollutants than others. And those are primarily children, the elderly, and a lot of communities of color and people of lower incomes because of a lot of different factors like smaller unit size or more people for buildings or already having asthma in the first place, which we know is a profoundly inequitable disease. And I think also one where children's lungs are developing for 6 years, and there's a real like public health imperative to address some of these pollutants at their sources, which is really easy to do if you electrify. Can you remove a combustion device? You also remove the combustion pollutants like carbon monoxide and nitrogen dioxide. You still will have some pollutants indoors from your pets and candles and cooking food, but we can do a great job of changing those pollutants indoors. And I guess I think what we know is if we had a heat map of the US and we saw where air quality outdoors is really bad, it would show up in lower income neighborhoods and neighborhoods where people of color and communities of color are. And so I've had this discussion with environmental justice groups and policymakers in the same room, and where policymakers feel like they need more data, more stats, more information on these impacts in order to make policy decisions, and the environmental justice community say, we don't need another study, we are living this every day, what we need is more visibility. And so I think the challenge for policymakers is how can you make sure these voices have a seat at the table, that their needs, concerns, etc. are being met, and that they are getting the visibility that they need. You know, this is a long history of inequitable air pollution in this country, but buildings are an untapped source that we often don't think about, and I think represent a really, I don't want to say easy, but a great opportunity for us to address them. We know in California, all of the buildings produce almost as much nitrogen dioxide outdoors as the whole light duty vehicle fleet. So now that you guys are going to get rid of gas cars, buildings have got to be next, and we will see those benefits in neighborhoods that have the highest levels of nitrogen dioxide. So there's a lot more that I could say there, but I think just to sum, I would say humans and how we interact with buildings have to start becoming more of the narrative. Policymakers have to weave in these funding and also policy opportunities with the health and the energy communities. And we really can start to unlock in creative ways, I think, additional fundings that can provide the incentives or subsidies to make the changeover in places where people have the least leverage, lots of renters or for example. So let's get creative, weaving these together in an effort to better address this in a holistic way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was very insightful, and especially knowing those statistics and the numbers that you said, that some of them are so alarming. And the point you mentioned about EPA not having guidelines about indoor air pollution. So some of the bad air quality standards that we have indoors, if we had the same air quality outdoors, then EPA would probably not be okay with it. But it's bad enough that we have it indoors. But also the fact that you mentioned about the equity side and the low income side. And I'm trying to think of this in a more local way. And in the Bay Area here, there's a lot of low income communities and there's a lot of cities in the Bay Area here itself in California. And so what would be your sort of suggestions, or how do you think from a more localized point of view, city governments, you know, who have a certain number of people, or they can address it in a more pointed way, that these are the number of disadvantaged communities, or you know, multifamily low-income buildings that we have, and how can they address it, or bring it into a policy code or reach code, you know?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. In the absence of federal standards that are health protective for outdoor air quality, and in the absence of federal guidelines for indoor air quality, this is where I think more local districts, like all the great air districts you have in California, most states that I work with don't have as many air districts actively working on this. And so we've seen in California, in the South Coast and the Bay Area, movement on setting ultra low NOx or nitrogen oxide standards for appliances. And this is one way to really cut down on neighborhood level outdoor pollution. I think this is really critical. This is a key pollutant to address. And so I would encourage air districts and others in these local levels, if you have high nitrogen dioxide, which in California you do, let's go to zero. We know how bad it is and we're learning every year. So I think setting a zero NOx standard for appliances would make a huge difference. In fact, a study just came out on Tuesday showing that of particulate matter, ozone, and nitrogen dioxide and COVID-19 mortality, nitrogen dioxide was the strongest association, and a very small decrease, 4.6 parts per billion in long-term nitrogen dioxide exposures could have saved an estimated nearly 15,000 lives. So, you know, this is obviously over a long period of time, but we should try to cut down on our outdoor nitrogen oxide pollution, because that's where regulators do have more opportunities. We are also pushing very hard with CARB and with the support of some air districts to set these indoor air quality guidelines. And then we hope we can make sure that the products that we have in our homes are meeting that criteria to be protective of health. We're also seeing a lot of doctors, nurses, and health practitioners from California and from the Bay Area. Climate Health Now is one that comes to mind, who are coming out and speaking out and asking for this, because they're the ones seeing the kids coming in time and time again with long-term asthma attacks and everything else. And so I think there's a mobilization effort that is already happening in California and particularly in the Bay Area. And I think figuring out who are your policymakers that can make a change. I think air districts are a great place to start for this. And then also some utilities in California are doing induction stove lender products. So if you do have a gas stove at home with maybe minimal or no ventilation, you can actually borrow for free a plug-in induction cooktop and try it in your home. And I think that's a really great way to introduce folks to induction with a very low commitment way to get started, and that can immediately reduce pollutants inside the home.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. I think all those points should be factored into the policy and the regulations that local city governments are making, and that makes a great case for actually electrifying our buildings even sooner than 2022. So we are going over to the next topic, and which is kind of towards the closing session of our panel discussion here today. So I will try to get some closing remarks and comments from each of our speakers today here. And if you could also tell us, in your experience and your expertise, what you think is the biggest roadblock or the biggest gap in achieving 100% building decarbonization, and what's your solution to it? So Brian, if you want to come in. Brian, I think you're muted.
This is a huge question, and as I said before, I don't think there's any one biggest roadblock in this thing. We're so wound up around the axle that it really is. There's so many different angles that we need to be working on, and the important thing is that we start working on every single angle, because until we do, they're going to have a reason why we can't do it, right? Until we start working on rates, and until we start working on decommissioning the gas system, and until we start working on making sure that we have all connected technologies and things like that, we're not going to, they're always going to have an excuse. So I think the important thing, the biggest roadblock in my mind, is just getting everybody working on every angle. And then once that happens, I really appreciated what Brady said in building the narrative. Right now, the narrative, you know, the American Gas Association has an Instagram influencer campaign called Cooking with Gas, and it's where people are talking and raving about how much they love their gas stove, because they know people have this emotional attachment to their gas stove. You know, it's only maybe 5% of their actual sales, but they know that that's the thing that people are going to get up in arms about. You know, they're coming for your stove, right? So it's really important that we start to build that narrative that that natural gas isn't a bridge fuel. We've reached the end of the bridge. You know, we're poisoning rural America, because it's true, and it is. It's now the fastest growing source of global pollution. So we need to absolutely flip the narrative, and start with that, and then, you know, just attack every single policy opportunity there is, and use policy to drive the market. A lot of times in our building codes we say, well, what's the market share right now? And we use that to say, is it market ready? And we almost need to be saying, let's use our policy tools to create a market, so that we can get over the customer value issues. We can get to sufficient scale so that we've got, so prices come down, you know, things like that. We need to, but I think it starts with just making sure that we have every angle covered, and I think we're moving that way. And then really getting that narrative that is solid. Everybody's got to be saying the same thing, you know, and then, you know, one of the really important groups that we need to bring to the table is the utility unions. They're still really very closely tied. They're a very politically powerful organization, and I think it's something that we need to bring them to the table and help them see that they're not doing their workers any favors by not being part of this conversation. Until every gas line is ripped up, we're going to need trained gas utility workers, and so the important thing is to think about what's next, because the writing's on the wall for the natural gas industry, and they're just not representing their workers if they're not coming to the table and negotiating and making sure that there's a just transition. So I think that's sort of some of my big pieces. Like, we got the Advanced Clean Truck Rule passed because the electricians union, the IBEW, was all in for it, because deploying that much electrical infrastructure to support 100% zero emissions vehicles is a huge workforce opportunity for them. And we need to have that same mentality with buildings. Unfortunately, there's the job creation infrastructure that needs to be created versus upgrading existing infrastructure. It's not as much of a jobs tailwind for them, but it is we need to get them to the table. They need to see that this is in their workers' interest for them to be part of the conversation.
Yeah. Ben?
So for closing remarks, what I would say is that looking at developing or kind of retrofitting a building is always understanding that a building from an energy system perspective is a 30 to 50 year resource. And depending on how you design it, it could be a 30-year resource for the energy system, or a 30-year kind of challenge that energy system has to work around. That's from the utility perspective, and that's how we kind of have this discussion. So in opportunities where we can build, or where we can build back better, we should take those opportunities as much as possible from a societal standpoint. But also understand that buildings, especially from an energy perspective, as Brady mentioned, are a grid resource to us energy wonkies, but their homes, their communities, their workplaces, they serve another purpose that really gets after how we've all kind of started here, which is how do we improve our quality of life in the environments in which we design and create. And so one of the things that is important to understand is there are non-energy benefits that are really driving these discussions, both from kind of even in our own, from a market standpoint, but also in a policy standpoint. How do we start taking some of these non-energy benefits that we talked about, collecting information on how that makes energy impacts, and then starting to drive the conversation from not only an economics, but a market, but from a policy standpoint, that these type of low carbon, zero carbon communities are actually improving our quality of life.
Absolutely. Brady?
So ditto to what Ben and Brian have said. I'll just echo and say the two biggest roadblocks I see are, one, just raising awareness about this and as quickly as possible. I feel an urgency, and I'm not sure that that we all feel an urgency, but in the wider population, I'm not sure if it's there. And so that goes into my second roadblock, which I think is just inertia. I think we're fighting against inertia and political will. And what was it, Greta Thunberg, I think, said, like, we need to be acting as if our house is on fire. And I think it's just this whole element of a lot of these things don't jump out right away as being so pressing and needing to solve. But I think from our policymakers, this is really where we need to raise the awareness so we can put the pressure on to fight inertia of changing the way things have been. So that gets into a little bit about how I think it can happen. And I guess just one other fear that I have, or a way that I think we can address this that I've learned from the time in global cook stoves, is there can be a lot of focus on low-hanging fruit. And maybe in this case, that's passing laws that for new construction. And I think those are critically important, but we have to make sure that we don't fill up on the new fruit, the low-hanging fruit, and start addressing the thornier issues at the same time, not leaving them for later. And by thornier issues, I mean things like existing buildings, especially in lower income communities where, as Brian was saying before, you know, the cost is such a big problem, and the cost of both switching to electric, and then what happens if gas becomes more expensive, and so those folks. So I would just say, let's keep going urgently ahead. We can focus, and we should focus on these low-hanging fruits, but we can't fill up, and we have to be addressing the harder to solve thornier issues at the same time.
Absolutely. Thank you. Those were great comments from Brian, Ben, and Brady. Thank you so much. And I think this has been a wonderful session. Thanks a lot. It was very informative, and there was a lot of learning here today. And we will move on to the Q&A part now. We have some questions coming in from the audience. And Catherine here wants to know that, hasn't San Francisco already required all new residential buildings to be electric? And if so, what were the lessons that they learned there? And could it be replicated elsewhere? If anybody wants.
I guess I'll take that.
Yeah.
Sure, yeah. San Francisco has, and they're one of many. There's a growing number of cities who are looking at this and taking action. There's probably, I think, 35 now is what the count's at in California. And, you know, there's a chance that by the end of this year, we could have as much as 40% of California's population living in an area that has adopted an all-electric reach code. And the next step is to start thinking about what we can do with existing buildings. It might not be cities who take action on existing buildings. As Brady said, it's the air quality districts that can really have an impact on some of those local air regs. In terms of the lessons that we feel like we've been learning, the value of doing it all at once, so that you don't have one organization like Berkeley did it and they got sued, but you know, they can't file 35 lawsuits. We can't, you know, so we can really keep their head on a swivel and have them playing whack-a-mole. The other thing is that we've caught the attention of Wall Street. We've caught the attention of manufacturers. There's been several articles published talking about the future of natural gas might not look so bright. Like I mentioned, the manufacturers are interested in either not opposing an all-electric 2022 code, or you know, or coming to the table and wanting to be part of the negotiations around it, because they really don't like the idea of a fragmented market. When you think about it, we're the 5th largest economy in the world. So every time that we fracture that market, we're making it harder and harder for them to sell, and they don't want that, and we don't want that. We want it to be, but you know, it's really the value of collective action. And you know, some of the other things that I think we're learning about the collective action stuff is when you look at the Advanced Clean Truck Rule, we'd ideally like to see other states signing on to follow suit with whatever California is doing, so that we send a really strong signal to the market that this is the direction and the writing's on the wall. Because that's really, you know, we're just getting a drop in the bucket barely, and the important thing is just that it's having an impact that is outsized from its carbon emissions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think California is definitely leading the way in paving new paths for building electrification and lots of other clean energy plans as well. So I think we've had a great discussion on building decarbonization, and we are almost at time. So we are not able to take any more questions, but we would love to hear more from our audience. So please do write into us. And I want to thank all of our speakers today, Ben, Brian, and Brady. Thank you so much for being on our panel and sharing your insights and expertise today. And thank you so much, everyone who joined us. And thanks for tuning in. And I hope you have benefited from our discussion today. We will be back with our next speaker series webinar very soon. And we'll be putting up all of our updates on our website and Eventbrite page. So thank you again so much. Goodbye and have a nice weekend.